Hello, my name is Jimmy Love, and I'm completing this assignment to satisfy the expectations for EDA 76200 as Educational Policy, Politics, and Social Justice, Summer 23. This assignment challenges me to use a quilt to express what shapes my perspective on social justice. The concept of a quilt is historically connected to um, things that are close, things that are protective, things that are traditional to a certain person or family, things that are valued. And so here is my perspective. Thank you. My perspective on social justice and social justice theory actually began when I began. Although I was not conscious as a newborn, I was certainly born into strife, poverty, and challenging times. I remember as a young child enduring many things that I did not see uh, people on TV enduring. And so, even as a lost little boy, I had an ideal that there was deprivation in the place that I lived. And that deprivation was beyond um, merely not having things to eat and uh, things of that nature. I witnessed things that would traumatize children, and certainly I carry a lot of strife and scar tissue, so to speak, to this day. Well, my perspective on social justice, my quilt, my quilt entails uh, just a reference to the racial gap, which is where my mind goes when I consider justice itself. I consider fairness, and so my quilt certainly is indicative of the great disparity of my life and the great disparity of the positions in which I've stood and where I have been. And so I will explain my quilt some here. I began with I remember for well I'll do it more like a tour, if so to speak. And so up towards the left, I experienced food stamps. I remember having to go to the store, and they would not allow you to use the tens. You could always use the ones. I remember that, but you could not use the tens and the five unless you had the matching booklet. And so I remember getting turned away a lot of times when my mom would send me. And I also remember what turned out to be crime, because we could go buy things that were not food with those food stamps from certain merchants. The racial gap has always been a part of my life. I've witnessed it as a student in schools, albeit growing up in the 70s and 80s as an elementary student. Well, more or less in the 70s, late mid to late 70s as an element. Well, actually the late 70s as an elementary, pre-K and one to first and second grade. There was no more segregation, but schools were still reeling from the great the great problems that were uh, still um, you know occurring as a result of what the things that happened educationally with the segregation in the school system. And so schools were certainly not fixed by the time I began school. And St. Louis Public School had many problems with just the buildings themselves, and certainly staff that I don't recall knowing how to really handle students like me. Well, to continue my social consciousness or my social justice theory, I've always had, it's like a lingering presence. So even here in St. Louis, where up towards the right, the top there, 100 Negroes shot, burned, and clubbed to death in East St. Louis. I certainly didn't have any family members that endured that, and I was not a part of that. But when you grow up in a community this close, right in the home of something like that that happened, and relatively recently, that certainly molds your consciousness, your social justice consciousness. And so even below that, where I say, well, I don't say, but I put a clip that suggests that drugs have always been a very, very big part of the communities that I've lived in. Drugs have been the reason, direct reason, that a lot of my family members are no longer with us. A lot of my peers that I grew up with, kindergarten and whatnot, they certainly died violently related to drugs. I have a lot of friends and stuff that grew up to be, well, more or less I would say associates that grew up to they're in prison now relating to drugs. So drugs have always been a part of the social consciousness, but it's more than just the usage and the distribution from the dope dealers and whatnot. The bigger picture, the consciousness that was developed as I matured was certainly the black folks that are in the minorities, I should say, that are using these drugs and succumbing and killing their lives, and nowadays certainly overdosing to these drugs. They're not the suppliers, they're not the developers, they're not the transporters, and so it certainly becomes a greater picture. And certainly the violence that winds up happening in the community, violence that I've witnessed up close and personal, violence that has traumatized me, things that I can't unsee, it certainly has shaped my social consciousness of, again, the fact, not just the myth or the opinion, but the fact that entities beyond the minority communities and the low social and economic communities, great entities, perhaps that benefit from, of course, they benefit from the drug distribution and the profits, and perhaps even greater, certain entities benefit from just having a substance or a situation that could keep a whole entire community basically imprisoned to themselves due to the addictive nature of drugs and the subsequent violence that it cultivates. Moving on, I received free and reduced lunch throughout my life, and while there are stereotypes that go along with that, I certainly appreciate having been able to receive free and reduced lunch because we did not have adequate food at home. We've suffered from, just like a lot of the minority households these days, food limitation was a big part of my psychic, and we would have the welfare check at the beginning of the month, and so it's like a brief influx of food, but by the middle of the month and certainly towards the end, it was churches, going to churches to get boxes of food, or going to, certainly my parents were, well, my grandparents were creative with the way they fed us, but it was always a problem with food, and it was always a shortage in our household with food. Moving along, I endured, well, not that I endured, but my psychic, my mind, just the strength of black men, the strength of black people, the strength of struggle. And so my quilt also illustrates the Black Panther movement, and I certainly did not, not even aware of all of their their initiatives and their values and whatnot. But I know enough to know that they were clean people that were not afraid and wanted to help a community that was being targeted by great entities. And so my quilt certainly illustrates or includes them, a group that would be positive and serve in the black community to try to change what they were seeing. And as fast forward to the 2023, wow, what they were seeing and what I see now, many of them not around to see it anymore. And it may be good because many of the low SES communities are in worse shape than ever. In the center of my quilt is Harris Stowe University, historically black university, a historically minority university, and it's right there in center of downtown St. Louis. Well, I went to that school as an 8th grader as a part of a program that benefited low socioeconomic students. And so there were monies and whatnot earmarked to develop programs, pathway programs, to help minority schools. Henry Givens was the president of Harris Stowe for a long time, and now it's a university. And so Harris Stowe being a constant, before it was this more modern university and more expansive space, it was a building with a couple of other buildings, but it was also right directly across from what was called Laclede Town. And Laclede Town was one of the more violent and more, it was a projects. You had Laclede Town, Cochran projects, and so I had family and friends that lived in those projects, and it was bad. And going in there, sometimes you didn't know if you were going to come out of there, and so of course they wound up tearing all of that down and developing what is now a great campus in Harris Stowe. So as my social consciousness goes, and my theory of as social justice theory goes, I'm certainly conscious of the value of education and the power of education